Hi, my name is Mrs. Freiwaltz. I'm the middle school librarian, and I'm here with my buddy Cheddar to share one of the Treasure State nominees, Honey, the Dog Who Saved Lincoln. This book was written by Sherry Swanson and is illustrated by Chuck Groening. The story of Honey, the Dog Who Saved Lincoln, is a true story. And here's our story. Young Abraham Lincoln was kneeling deep in the woods when 3 shrill blasts of a whistle cut through the quiet. His corn was ready at the mill, and he was late. Watching a frog limp into the brush, Abe smiled. It wasn't every day he was able to rescue a frog right out of a snake's mouth. Abe hurried back to where Mr. Hodgin, the miller, was waiting. "Now, Abe, what took you so long this time?" Mr. John asked. "I just can't move along fast like some boys, Mr. John, because I see so many little foolish things that make me stop. I can't help it to save my life." Mr. John patted the boy's head and handed him a sack of ground corn. "Now, get on your way, Abe. You'd best be home before dark." Abe heaved the bag onto his shoulder and set off on the long path that wound its way like a rusty snake through Knob Creek Hills to the Lincolns' log cabin. Abe only had a mile or so left to go when something caught his attention. He froze. Was that rustling in the bushes? Beneath some of the brambles at the base of a cliff, Abe found a dog whimpering softly. The dog's front leg was broken. "Did you fall, boy?" Abe asked. The dog looked up into Abe's eyes, wagging his tail. Abe patted the gentle dog's head and looked around for something to use to set the leg. He was only 7 years old, but Abe had spent his whole life on a Kentucky farm and knew how to tend animals. He pared 2 sticks smooth with his pocket knife to make a splint. Then he peeled the soft bark off a pawpaw bush to wrap around the sticks. Finally, he tied it all around the dog's leg with some rawhide from his belt. By the time Abe was through, the sun was slanting low through the trees. Abe hefted the bag of ground corn back onto his shoulder and called to the dog. The dog struggled up and limped along after Abe on his 3 good legs. Abe was going to be late. That wasn't unusual, but this time he would have a dog to explain. Abe's father was asleep by the fire when Abe got home, but his mother was waiting up. "Oh, Abraham, where have you been off to this time? Didn't you know I would be worried?" "I found a real honey of a dog. His leg is broken," Abe whispered. "Please let me keep him." Abe looked up at his mother. "He'll do lots of good things for me," he told her. "You just watch and see." Nancy could never say no to her beloved boy, so the dog stayed. Abe snuck Honey scraps of food, and soon the dog was able to walk. Honey's leg looked like a curve in the road, but that didn't stop him from trotting along after Abe on their adventures. Everywhere Abraham went, Honey went. One day, Abe showed up late to drop off his grain at the mill. Mr. John shook his head. "Why do you fool your time away?" he asked Abe. "You have seen these hills and hollows hundreds of times. I can't understand what you find to keep you so long on the road." "Well, Mr. John," Abe answered, "Honey got a possum in a hollow stump, and I couldn't get him to leave it. And I couldn't leave Honey. Abe wandered off a bit to wait his turn. He took out a soapstone pencil to practice writing his letters on a bit of bark. But soon the woods were calling, and Abe got the itch to answer. Before long, he and Honey found themselves at the mouth of a cave. Deep, twisting caverns travel for hundreds of miles under Kentucky. A boy and his dog could get lost in caverns like these. And, sure enough, disaster struck. Abe got jammed between two boulders and couldn't move. Try as he might, pulling himself this way, that way, and back again, he was hopelessly stuck, and night was beginning to fall. Honey whimpered and pawed at the ground. Abe couldn't move. Honey normally never left Abe, but this time he headed alone back into the darkening woods. Honey would need to get help. Back at the mill, the entire town had gathered in the night to search for Abe. Mr. John had been blowing and blowing on his whistle, but Abe hadn't come. Nancy Lincoln asked Mr. John, "Have you seen the dog, Mr. Hodgin? Was Honey with Abraham when he came to the mill?" "Yes, the dog was with him," answered Mr. John. Abe's mother was grateful for Honey. It comforted her to know Abe had him for protection. She waited anxiously at the edge of the dark forest, hoping her boy would come home. "Here's Honey, she called. Suddenly, Honey emerged from the bushes, barking and whining at Nancy's feet. The dog looked up into the faces of one after another until he got to Mr. John. Then Honey jumped up on Mr. John and barked in his face. "Grab your torches," called Mr. John. "We'll follow where the dog leads." Yelping and panting, Honey headed back through the woods. The townsfolk followed behind him, their torches parting the night. When they got to the cave entrance, Honey stopped. The townsfolk were afraid. Many a silent prayer went up for the boy's safety. Mr. John blew 3 times on his cane pole whistle. "Here I am," called Abe, his voice echoing from deep within the cavern. "But I'm fastened." Mr. John carefully made his way down into the damp, narrow tunnel. He found Abraham tightly wedged, but had no room to swing a sledge to break the rocks. Mr. John could only tug Abe out, even though it meant leaving some of the boy's hide behind. Once Abe was back up into the night air, Nancy rushed to hold her beloved son and his precious dog. Abraham was surprised at the crowd. He smiled at his mother. "I knew Honey would do great things for me," he said. "Now he has paid me back for mending his broken leg." The next day, and for many more days after that, Abe and Honey were back at their adventures, bumping and scrambling their way along the banks of Knob Creek. A boy and his loyal dog, Honey. Do you remember I said at the beginning of the story that it was a true story? In this book, is a timeline, so it tells all about Abraham Lincoln's life and his animal encounters. It talks about when Abraham Lincoln lived in Kentucky, and the years that he lived in Indiana and Illinois, and finally, when he was president, the years he lived in Washington, D.C. The author also has some other very interesting information. Before he was president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln was a young boy running barefoot through the hills and hollows of Knob Creek, Kentucky. He was born during a fierce winter storm on February 12, 1809, and spent the first years of his life in a one-room log cabin with just one tiny window peeking out into the untamed world. The events of this story are true, as remembered by Abe's childhood best friend, Austin Gollaher. Back then, before people learned to read and write, they passed their stories on orally. They told them aloud. Austin enjoyed telling boys and girls the stories about his childhood adventures with Abraham Lincoln. One Kentucky child, J. Rogers Gore, grew up to be a journalist who wrote stories down in a book, The Boyhood of Abraham Lincoln, from the spoken narratives of Austin Gullher. For the most part, the incidents and quotations are recounted here exactly as Austin remembered them or heard tell of them from Abe or other people in town. Austin told Mr. Gore these stories many decades after they happened, so they might not have been relayed perfectly, but undoubtedly the essence of Abe's friendship with Honey is true. Austin fondly remembered his adventures with Abe and Honey. He told of the time Honey saved them from a wildcat, and of the time when a scraggly stranger with a long scar curving from his eye to his mouth came into town and claimed that Honey was his dog, Whistle. And his saddest story, when he watched the Lincolns leave for Indiana. The two boys hugged their goodbyes. Then Abe broke away to lead the family cow across a stream, Honey following behind. Honey wasn't the only animal Abe saved when he lived in Kentucky. He had a tame crow that he and Austin tried to teach to talk, a goat they tried to teach to pull a cart, and a tame raccoon that Honey would herd back into the yard if it strayed. Abe also released many animals from traps set by his father in the woods, much to his father's dismay. When he became president, Abraham Lincoln filled the White House with animals, including a little goat that pulled his son Tad through the halls in a cart. Today, you can visit a replica of Abe's childhood cabin nestled next to Knob Creek, among the hills and hollows of Hodgenville, Kentucky, where Abe and Honey once roamed free.